On the 9th of October 1944, Winston Churchill sat across a table from Joseph Stalin in Moscow. The war was not over. Allied soldiers were still dying. Polish fighters were still bleeding in the rubble of Warsaw. Churchill took a half sheet of paper and wrote 5 countries on it. Romania, 90%, Greece, 90%, Yugoslavia, 50-50, Hungary, 50-50, Bulgaria, 75%. He pushed the paper across the table. Stalin read it, picked up a blue pencil, made a single large tick, and pushed it back. Churchill looked at the paper. Then he said something that is in his own published memoirs. Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of such issues so fateful to millions of people in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper. Stalin said no. Keep it. That half sheet of paper decided the political future of more than 70 million people. 5 countries, 3 of them handed to Soviet control, 1 kept for Britain, 1 split down the middle, confirmed with a blue tick. In a matter of moments. No treaty was signed, no parliament was consulted. No citizen of Romania or Bulgaria or Hungary or Yugoslavia was told that their country had been allocated to a foreign power on a scrap of paper over an evening meeting in Moscow. The question this video investigates is not whether Churchill had the right to do this. The question is why he had to. Because Churchill did not trade away Eastern Europe out of ideology or cruelty. He traded it because Britain was broke. By October 1944, Britain had spent virtually all of its reserve capital. War production consumed 55% of national output. The country was surviving on American credit. And a man who could no longer pay for the war he was fighting did what any desperate debtor does when the creditors are at the door. He sold what he could no longer afford to keep. This is the documented financial story of how Winston Churchill liquidated the sovereignty of 5 nations to preserve the one asset Britain still needed, control of the Mediterranean route to the Suez Canal, and how the soldiers who fought for him were never told what he had traded away on their behalf. To understand why Churchill wrote those percentages on a half sheet of paper, you have to understand what had happened to the British Treasury between 1939 and 1944. When the war began, Britain was the center of the largest empire in human history. It controlled territory on every continent. Its currency was the global reserve. The city of London was the financial capital of the world. The Bank of England held $4.2 billion in gold and foreign currency reserves. By April 1941, those reserves had fallen to $12 million. $4.2 billion to $12 million in less than 2 years. Britain had spent almost everything it had buying weapons, fuel, raw materials, and food from the United States, the only industrial power not under direct military threat. The British government had sold over $820 million of its American investments to fund purchases. It had liquidated assets accumulated across generations. And it was still not enough. In November 1940, Lord Lothian, Britain's ambassador to the United States, arrived at LaGuardia Airport in New York. Reporters met him on the tarmac. Lothian looked at them and said 6 words that are in the historical record. "Well, boys, Britain's broke. It is your money we want." Churchill was furious at the diplomatic bluntness. But Lothian was telling the truth. Britain could not pay for the war. It was fighting. It could not buy the weapons it needed. It could not feed its own population without American imports. The empire that had ruled a quarter of the world's surface could not write a check that would clear. What followed was the Lend-Lease program. Franklin Roosevelt proposed it in December 1940. The United States would supply Britain with the weapons and materials it needed to fight Germany. Britain would not pay immediately. Instead, the supplies would be lent. Payment would come later in a form to be determined. Churchill later called it the most unsorted act one nation had ever done for another. But there was nothing unsorted about the terms that accompanied it. Britain was required to sell off its remaining American investments. It was required to open its empire to American trade. And it was required to accept that the United States, not Britain, would design the post-war economic order. By 1944, the numbers were beyond recovery. Britain's war production consumed 55% of its entire national output. Export volume had collapsed to 30% of pre-war levels. The country owed £3.4 billion to creditors around the world, much of it to India, Egypt, and other colonies that had supplied labor and materials for a war, fought primarily in defense of British interests. These were the sterling balances, debts owed by the imperial center to its own periphery. The empire had been built on the premise that wealth flowed from the colonies to London. By 1944, the flow had reversed. London owed its colonies more than it could repay. India alone was owed over £1.3 billion. The jewel in the crown had become the creditor. The national debt had risen above 200% of gross domestic product. the same level it had reached after the Napoleonic Wars over a century earlier. The wartime net loss in British national wealth amounted to 18.6% of the country's entire pre-war wealth, £4.5 billion at 1938 prices destroyed or spent in 6 years. Britain had also sold over £1 billion of its overseas investments to fund the war. The income from those investments, which had been a structural pillar of British financial power since the Victorian era, was gone permanently. The empire was still fighting. Its soldiers were still advancing. Its flag still flew over territory on every continent. But the financial reality beneath that flag was that Britain was operating on borrowed money, borrowed time, and borrowed power. The country that had financed the defeat of Napoleon, that had funded the Industrial Revolution, that had built the largest commercial navy in history, that country could no longer afford to keep the lights on without American permission. This is the financial position Winston Churchill carried with him when he boarded the plane to Moscow in October 1944. He was not traveling as the leader of the world's greatest power. He was traveling as the leader of a bankrupt empire that still had soldiers in the field and no money left to determine what would happen when they came home. Churchill said it himself. Up to July 1944, England had considerable say in things. After that, I was conscious that it was America who made the big decisions. By October 1944, the United States had nearly 3 times as many troops committed to the European theater as Britain. American industrial output dwarfed British production. American money was keeping the British war economy alive. Churchill still had his voice. He still had his rhetoric. He still had his reputation. But he did not have the financial power to enforce his will on the post-war settlement. So he went to Moscow to make the best deal a bankrupt man could make, and the currency he used was other people's countries. If this is the kind of documented financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to this channel. The paper trail in this video has been open for 80 years. The financial collapse of Britain during the war is documented in detail. But what is rarely taught alongside it is the specific strategic calculation Churchill made as a result. He did not simply accept British decline, he managed it. And what he managed was a liquidation, a controlled disposal of assets that Britain could no longer defend, in exchange for preserving the one strategic position that still mattered to a maritime empire running on American fuel. That position was the Mediterranean. And everything that happened in Moscow in October 1944 follows from that calculation. The conference was codenamed Tolstoy. Churchill arrived in Moscow on the 9th of October 1944 with his Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Roosevelt was not present. He was running for his 4th presidential term and could not attend. He sent a telegraph to Stalin expressing regret and asked that the American ambassador Averell Harriman be allowed to observe the proceedings. Harriman was politely excluded from the key meeting. The 2 men who sat down to divide Europe did so without the 3rd member of the alliance in the room. Churchill opened by discussing Poland briefly. Then he moved to the Balkans. His own account in his memoirs records what he said next. Let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. That word. Affairs. As though the sovereignty of 5 nations were a business arrangement between 2 men who had the authority to close it. Churchill wrote his percentages on a half-sheet of paper. Romania. Russia, 90%. The others, 10%. Greece. Great Britain, 90% in accord with Russia. Russia 10%, Yugoslavia 50-50, Hungary 50-50, Bulgaria, Russia 75%, the others 25%. He pushed it across the table. Stalin paused, then took his blue pencil and made a large tick on the paper. He passed it back without a word. There was a long silence. Churchill broke it. He suggested they burn the paper. Stalin told him to keep it. The next day, Eden and Molotov sat down to refine the numbers. Bulgaria was amended from 75% Soviet to 80%. Hungary was amended from 50-50 to 80% Soviet. Apart from those 2 changes, no other countries were discussed. The refinement made it worse. What had been a split was now a concession. Look at the numbers again. Romania, 90% Soviet. Bulgaria, 80%. Hungary, 80%. 3 countries with a combined population of over 30 million people allocated to Soviet control in exchange for one thing. Greece, 90% British. Why Greece? Not because of Greek democracy. Not because of Greek culture. Not because Churchill had any particular affection for the Greek people. Because Greece sat at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. And the Mediterranean was not a body of water to Churchill, it was a balance sheet. Every British warship sailing to the Indian Ocean passed through Greek waters. Every oil tanker returning from the Persian Gulf passed through the Suez Canal and into the eastern Mediterranean. Every cargo vessel connecting Britain to its remaining colonial possessions in Africa and Asia used the same route. The Suez Canal had been under effective British control since 1875, when the British government purchased a 44% share in the Suez Canal Company from the debt-ridden Egyptian government for £4 million. That purchase, made because Egypt could not pay its creditors, had given Britain the single most important commercial choke point on earth. 70 years later, Churchill was in Moscow protecting it with the only currency he had left: other people's sovereignty. A Soviet-controlled Greece would have given Moscow a direct position on the Mediterranean for the first time in Russian history. Russian strategic ambition to access the Mediterranean through the Black Sea and the Straits had been a constant of European diplomacy for over a century. A communist Greece would have opened the door that every Tsar and every Russian government had been trying to push through since Catherine the Great. It would have threatened the Suez Canal. It would have cut Britain's sea route to what remained of its empire. It would have ended Britain's claim to be a global power at the precise moment when that claim was already hanging by a financial thread. A British internal policy document from 1944 states it directly. Our long-term policy towards Greece is to retain her in the British sphere of influence. A Russian-dominated Greece would not be acceptable to British strategy in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is the financial logic of the percentages agreement. Churchill was not trading nations for nations. He was trading nations for a shipping lane. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary sacrificed to protect the route through which British oil and British trade and British military access still flowed. The Mediterranean was the last piece of infrastructure that gave Britain any claim to global power. Everything else was already mortgaged to the Americans. The Mediterranean was the one thing Churchill could still defend, and it was the one thing he refused to give away. Churchill himself acknowledged it later. In a 1956 interview, he said it plainly. "Stalin never broke his word to me. We agreed on the Balkans. I said he could have Romania and Bulgaria, and he said we could have Greece. He said it as though it were a reasonable exchange. As though Romania and Bulgaria were his to give." If you are watching this video and recognizing the pattern, where the financial position of a nation determines who it sacrifices and who it protects, you are seeing exactly what this channel was built to document. Subscribe, and I will see you at every paper trail. The percentages agreement was written on the 9th of October. The refinements were completed by the 11th. But the real cost of what Churchill had traded away was not paid in Moscow. It was paid in Warsaw. 1 month before Churchill sat down with Stalin, a city had been burning, and the people inside it were fighting and dying in the belief that their British ally would not abandon them. On the 1st of August 1944, 69 days before Churchill wrote the percentages agreement, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. 42,000 fighters rose against the German occupation. They included teenagers. They included women. Most of them were armed with nothing more than pistols and homemade grenades. They seized 2/3 of the city in 3 days. They expected the Soviet Red Army, which had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula River within sight of Warsaw, to cross and join the fight. The Soviets had been broadcasting from Radio Kosciuszko, calling on the people of Warsaw to rise up. The hour of action has struck. Attack the Germans. Help the Red Army to cross the Vistula. Send us information. Show us the way. Those broadcasts are in the historical record. The Soviet government used its own radio station to tell the people of Warsaw to fight. And when they fought, the Soviet army sat on the opposite bank of the river and did nothing. The Red Army stopped. It sat on the east bank of the Vistula and watched. Stalin later told Churchill that a major German counterattack had halted the Soviet advance, that it had to be kept secret for strategic reasons. Every contemporary German military source contradicts this. The Germans believed the Soviets were trying to link up with the resistance. They believed it was their own defense that stopped the advance. The Soviet pause was a political decision, not a military one. Stalin wanted the Home Army destroyed. He wanted the Polish government in exile in London to lose its military arm. He wanted to install his own communist administration in Poland without opposition. Letting the Germans do the killing served that purpose. For 63 days, the Polish Home Army fought the Wehrmacht inside Warsaw while the Soviet army observed from across the river. The Germans sent in SS units. The Durla-Wenger Brigade, composed of convicted criminals, conducted systematic massacres of civilians. In the first 3 days of the German counterattack in the Wola district alone, 30,000 civilians were murdered. Patients in hospitals were executed in their beds, Churchill was told. On the 12th of August, he received a message from the fighters inside Warsaw. "We are conducting a bloody fight. The town is cut by 3 routes. Each route is strongly held by German tanks. They begged for supplies. They begged for airdrops. They said only one small drop had come from the Allies. The soldiers and the population of the capital look hopelessly at the skies expecting help from the Allies. On the background of smoke, they see only German aircraft." Churchill authorized RAF bombers to fly from Foggia in southern Italy over 1,200 miles of hostile airspace to drop supplies over Warsaw. 5 out of 20 aircraft were shot down on one mission alone. The supplies that reached the city were a fraction of what was needed. The distance from Italy made sustained air support impossible. There was a solution. The Soviet Union controlled 6 airfields in Poland. One of them was a 26-minute flight from Warsaw. If Allied planes could land on Soviet airfields, they could resupply the Polish fighters effectively. Churchill asked Stalin repeatedly. Stalin refused. On the 18th of August, the Soviet Deputy Commissar for Foreign Affairs formally prohibited American bombers from landing at the Poltava Air Base in Ukraine if the mission involved supplying Warsaw. Churchill telegrammed Roosevelt on the 25th of August. He proposed sending planes in defiance of Stalin. Let us see what happens. Roosevelt replied the next day, I do not consider it advantageous to the long-range general war prospect for me to join you. Roosevelt would not risk his relationship with Stalin over Warsaw. Churchill could not resupply Warsaw without Soviet cooperation or American support. The Polish Home Army fought on alone. On the 2nd of October 1944, General Borka-Moralski signed the capitulation. 15,000 Polish fighters had been killed. Up to 250,000 Polish civilians were dead. The Germans deported the surviving population and razed the city to the ground on Hitler's direct order. 85% of Warsaw was destroyed. 7 days later, Churchill sat down with Stalin in Moscow and wrote the percentages agreement. Poland was discussed briefly before moving on to the Balkans. The men who had watched Warsaw burn for 63 days, who had begged Stalin for airfield access and been refused, who had appealed to Roosevelt and been told no, that man sat across from Stalin 7 days after the uprising's collapse and wrote Romania 90% and pushed the paper across the table. There were over 200,000 Polish soldiers serving under Allied command at that time. Polish forces had captured the monastery at Monte Cassino in May 1944, where British and American and French and Indian forces had all been repelled. The Polish Second Corps under General Władysław Anders succeeded where every other Allied formation had failed. These were men who had been deported from eastern Poland to Soviet gulags in 1939 when Hitler and Stalin divided their country between them. When Churchill and Stalin formed their alliance against Hitler in 1941, the Poles were released from Siberia. They formed the Anders Army. They marched to Iran. They fought through North Africa. They fought through Italy. They bled at Cassino. And they did all of it in the belief that they were fighting to go home to a free Poland. Polish pilots had fought in the Battle of Britain. Polish Squadron 303 was one of the highest-scoring fighter squadrons during the battle. Polish codebreakers had made critical contributions to breaking the Enigma machine before the war, work that was later developed at Bletchley Park. Polish paratroopers had fought at Arnhem alongside the British in September 1944. These soldiers were fighting for the liberation of Europe on every front in the belief that their homeland would be free when the war ended. It would not be. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the borders agreed in Tehran were formalized. Poland's eastern territories were given to Stalin. When Polish Prime Minister Mikołajczyk had attended the Moscow Conference in October 1944, the same conference where Churchill wrote the percentages, he believed he was coming to discuss borders that were still open to negotiation. Molotov told him there was nothing to discuss. It was all settled in Tehran. 500,000 Polish soldiers refused to return to Poland after the war. Britain passed the Polish Resettlement Act of 1947, its first mass immigration law, to provide for the soldiers whose country it had helped to sign away. Henry Strauss, the Member of Parliament for Norwich, resigned his parliamentary seat in protest over Churchill's treatment of Poland. Churchill later commissioned a contingency military plan called Operation Unthinkable, a war against the Soviet Union to obtain what he called a square deal for Poland. The military assessment concluded the odds were unfavorable. The plan was shelved. The square deal never came. If this video is changing how you understand the relationship between Britain's financial collapse and the decisions made about Eastern Europe, share it with someone who still believes these were purely strategic military calculations. The financial paper trail tells a different story. Churchill watched Warsaw burn. He begged for airfield access and was refused. He appealed to Roosevelt and was told no. 7 days after the uprising collapsed, he sat across from the man who had let it happen and pushed a piece of paper across the table. But there is one country on that list where Churchill did not accept the percentage as an abstraction. One country where he personally intervened with military force to enforce his share. That country was Greece. And what happened there on Christmas Day 1944 tells you exactly what the percentages agreement was really about. In December 1944, 2 months after the percentages agreement, the communist-dominated resistance movement in Greece attempted to seize power in Athens. The EAM and its military wing ELAS had been the primary resistance force against the German occupation. They expected to govern. Churchill had other plans. On the 3rd of December 1944, tens of thousands of Greek Republicans and anti-monarchists gathered in Syntagma Square outside the Greek Parliament. They carried Greek flags, they carried American flags, they carried British flags. They chanted, "Long live Churchill! Long live Roosevelt! Long live Stalin!" These were the same people who had spent 3 years fighting alongside the British against the Nazi occupation. They were not marching against Britain. They were marching for the democratic future they believed Britain had promised them. British soldiers and Greek police opened fire from positions on the Parliament building and the Grande Bretagna Hotel. 28 protesters were killed. Hundreds were injured. The people carrying Churchill's name on their lips were shot by Churchill's soldiers. The fighting that followed lasted 37 days. Athens was turned into a battlefield. British warships bombarded parts of the city. The RAF flew low-level operations over the Greek capital. Britain had watched Warsaw burn without the means to intervene. It now used its army, its navy, and its air force to fight inside Athens, to enforce the 90% that Churchill had written on a half sheet of paper 2 months earlier. On Christmas Day 1944, Churchill personally flew to Athens with Anthony Eden. While Britain could not afford to defend Romania or Bulgaria or Hungary, while it had watched Warsaw burn for 63 days, it found the money and the men and the political will to fight in Greece. Because Greece was not expendable. Greece was the Suez route. Greece was the oil supply. Greece was the last physical connection between a bankrupt island and the remains of a global empire. Stalin kept his word. The Soviet Union did not intervene in Greece. Churchill later said it directly. When we went in 1944, Stalin did not interfere. This is the transaction in its clearest form. Churchill gave Stalin Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Stalin gave Churchill Greece. Both men honored the deal. The people of those countries were not consulted on either side. Every country on Churchill's list except Greece fell under communist control after the war. Romania became a Soviet satellite. Its king was forced to abdicate at gunpoint in December 1947. Bulgaria became a Soviet satellite. Its opposition leaders were executed. Hungary became a Soviet satellite, and when it tried to break free in 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the uprising, killing an estimated 2,500 Hungarians. Yugoslavia under Tito eventually broke from Moscow in 1948, but remained a communist state for another 4 decades. Greece, the one country Churchill fought for, remained in the Western sphere. It caused a civil war that lasted until 1949 and killed tens of thousands of people. But Greece stayed out of Soviet hands. The shipping lane stayed open. The pattern is consistent with the financial logic. The countries Churchill could not afford to defend were traded away. The country that sat on the shipping lane he needed was defended with British blood on Christmas Day. And the man who made that calculation knew exactly what he was doing. He said so in his own memoirs. He published the evidence himself. Churchill published the Percentages Agreement in 1953. He included it in the 6th and final volume of his wartime memoirs, Triumph and Tragedy. He described the moment in detail, the half sheet of paper, the blue pencil tick, the suggestion to burn it, Stalin's refusal. He called it his naughty document. Naughty. That was the word he chose for the disposal of 5 nations' sovereignty. Churchill's gift for language was immense, but on this occasion the understatement was itself a kind of confession. He knew what he had done. He published it anyway. And he used a word that made it sound like a schoolboy prank, rather than the largest single act of territorial concession by a Western leader since Munich. The Soviet government responded in 1956 by denying the agreement had ever existed. They called the document dirty and crude. Albert Rezes published the definitive academic study of the Percentages Agreement in the American Historical Review in 1978. His conclusion was that the agreement was a significant cause of the Cold War because it removed the free choice of Eastern European and Mediterranean peoples from choosing their own path forward after liberation from Nazi occupation. Every claim in this video is drawn from Churchill's own published memoirs, the British Foreign Office records released under the 30-year rule, the Hansard parliamentary debates from February 1945, and Rezes's American Historical Review paper. The documentation is publicly accessible. It has been for decades. The standard account of the Percentages Agreement treats it as a pragmatic act of wartime statecraft. 2 leaders dividing spheres of influence in the face of military reality. The documents support a more specific reading. A bankrupt empire trading nations it could no longer afford to defend in exchange for the one strategic asset, the Mediterranean route to the Suez Canal, that still connected it to the remnants of its global power. Churchill did not make the Percentages Agreement because he was cruel. He made it because the treasury was empty and the creditors were waiting, and the people who paid for it were the 70 million citizens of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Poland who spent the next 45 years behind the Iron Curtain. The paper was never burned. Churchill kept it. Then he published it. Then he called it naughty. The soldiers who fought for him were never asked what they thought. The citizens whose countries were traded were never told what had been written on their behalf. The paper trail has been open since 1953. The financial trail that explains why it was written has been open for just as long. If this video changed how you understand the relationship between financial power and territorial sovereignty, share it with someone who still believes the Cold War began because of ideology. It began because of arithmetic. 12 years after Churchill wrote the percentages agreement, Britain lost the Suez Canal anyway. In 1956, Egypt's President Nasser nationalized it. Britain and France invaded to take it back. The United States refused to support them. The pound collapsed. Britain withdrew. The one asset Churchill had traded 5 nations to protect was gone within a decade. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. I will see you in the next one.